Every movie production company is known for something. Maybe it's their specific animation style, their character design, or in some cases, their insatiable lust for global dominance promoted by a deceivingly innocent mascot. But in the case of Dreamworks, when I think of Dreamworks as a whole, I'm thinking of three big things: satire, comedic value, and clever scriptwriting. I know exactly what some of y'all are gonna write in the comments. Dreamworks is definitely more than just cheap fart jokes, although you can't deny they're good at it. I'm not by any means discrediting the emotional, powerful films they've made, like the How to Train Your Dragon series with its incredible soundtrack, thank you John, or the Kung Fu Panda series and how awesome the writing actually is. Like, seriously, it's pretty surprising. Or I mean, like The Prince of Egypt, come on. All of those are fantastic movies in their own way, but I know you read it in the title. I think that Monsters vs. Aliens is genuinely one of the most underrated Dreamworks movies and represents some of the best aspects of what this company can do. A lot of that has to do with its humor, which, even though I've seen this many times, made me genuinely laugh out loud rewatching it. It really nails that stupid humor, which admittedly I'm a sucker for, but a lot of it is actually really clever. A huge portion of the jokes in this movie are what I would call anti-jokes, where there's a big build-up, and the joke is that where a punchline would be, there's just something incredibly benign. Like this classic I remember all the way back from the trailer.
Look out! Here comes
Susan.
This movie features a lot of classic Dreamworks tropes and their signature clever writing. That's part of what I enjoy about Dreamworks as a whole. I found that their stuff is much more enjoyable as an adult, more than I do a lot of Disney stuff. As weird as it is to say, I think in that way, Dreamworks is more mature than Disney is.
What the
Sigma?
This piece of...
Like, their writing almost treats the audience with a higher level of maturity, and that means they can tell jokes that are genuinely funny for adults too, and not have to stoop to the level of telling kids jokes. And on that note, the biggest thing that stood out to me when I was rewatching this is all the ways it pokes fun at society, culture, and even common Hollywood tropes that are just incredibly overdone. I mean, just from the freaking title, you can tell this is gonna be satire. It's just so over the top. Like, imagine if this wasn't a comedy. Actually, now that I think about it, is this supposed to make fun of Alien vs. Predator? I don't even know. I've never seen it. I know I'm showing my age here, but was Alien vs. Predator even out when this first came out? Whatever, it's besides the point. But because it's obvious they're aware of how ridiculous those themes are, they're able to lean into it and create a movie that's really enjoyable and clever. And that's why I think it's peak Dreamworks. This company is arguably built off the back of the Shrek franchise, and honestly, the concept of the Shrek pentalogy and Monsters vs. Aliens are pretty similar. Where a series like Shrek is obviously trashing on the fairy tale sludge that is a lot of Disney movies and that whole magical genre, this one takes the entire genre of sci-fi and just points out how ridiculous it is. And in my opinion, it's funnier than most of the Shrek movies. Fight me. If I had to choose one genre for this movie, it would be satire. Because even further than just being a goofy, fun movie for kids, there's a lot of ways that they poke fun at pop culture. Like how America is the only country UFOs ever seem to land in. Or how Link says that the world getting hotter would be a convenient truth. I'm telling you, that's what still makes it funny as an adult. The mix of fart jokes and mad scientists, along with satirical comedy on the world. Another thing that makes it so clever is simply the characters. Like, first of all star cast. Pun intended. Really, like, come on, how could it be bad? There's something to be said for voice acting for sure. Every single one of these people is giving 110%. But also, because they're all very distinct monsters that have a background of their own, they're all super memorable and quotable. Dreamworks does really well not to oversaturate the amount of characters it focuses on, which I think can be one of the downfalls of other movies in a similar genre. Shrek! Each of them has their own background and motivations, making them all endearing in a way which makes them perfect companions for Susan. She fits right into their weird little tribe and even improves the camaraderie of the group. There's a major theme in this movie about being true to yourself, even when other people don't believe in you, and all that good stuff. Awesome, A+. But even more interesting to me is that there's a secondary moral created here surrounding the power of teamwork, and how each person, or monster's, characteristics all work together to save the day and make the world a better place. It sounds really cringy when you say it like that, but I think it's actually pretty clever. They just do it in what I consider to be a much more interesting way, and certainly less cliche than most movies with a similar lesson to be learned. Excluding Insectosaurus and Bob, who's just straight up comedic relief.
But as you can see, he has no brain. Turns out you don't need one!
Dr. Cockroach and Link actually get their own mini character arcs too. Overall, the main character hands down is Susan, obviously, but these two guys are in a similar boat. They're down on their luck. Nothing's working out for them. They've lost their edge. Link can't do a cannonball to impress the ladies, and Dr. Cockroach's entire monster status is because he screwed up an experiment. but they both end up regaining a level of confidence similar to the main character. It's actually a really solid writing technique to use your protagonist to prove a point and then reinforce that point in a new way with some lesser characters. By doubling down on that arc, they make it so much more impactful for the main character and build camaraderie with the gang along the way. Like I said, there's not much to analyze with Bob. The producers were just like, who can we get to play a goofy, gelatinous sludge? I think what really takes this movie up that last step above a lot of similar animated films is that they're able to retain some of the emotionality and the sad moments in the film while not sacrificing the satire. When Susan is put into the monster compound, there are some quick jokes, but you genuinely feel bad for the protagonist, or at least I do. She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't deserve to be separated from her family, and where she's ended up is pretty dismal. The way they portray that with her body language is actually really clever as well. Another emotional moment in the movie is obviously after Derek breaks up with her and the monsters ruin the party at her parents' house. They're all depressed, and the movie gives you a moment to really sit in that and just feel for the characters. They could have kept it going joke after joke, and I know there's a couple in there, but there's a lull in the action and the humor for a few minutes, and we get to really look into the characters and see what they're feeling. This is really excellent stuff, and there's a reason this is the transformative point in the hero's journey, which, by the way, this movie follows really well. They also do a really good job at incorporating side characters into the plot, using them for gags and development while not focusing on them too heavily. The two that stick out the most are General Monger and the President Stephen Colbert. And you might think that these two are just silly side characters who were used to commentate on the state of the American government / military-industrial complex. No. You misunderstand. They do that as well, but these two really hammer home the satirical take on sci-fi throughout the movie. You can't tell me you've seen a single alien invasion movie without a tough, no-nonsense general who helps save the day at the end of the film. Or name me one single classic alien movie where the US president doesn't play a big role for some reason in the plot. They're like two staples of the genre, and yeah, they do work to get laughs out of the audience, but woven into that is an obvious jab at science fiction in general. I think as I analyze films more and more, there's one thing that always impresses me about scriptwriters, is if they're able to use one event or character and make it multifaceted enough that it serves several different purposes in the film. Maybe it's advancing the plot, or advancing the themes, or whatever it may be. And you can see the way they did that with Monger and the President. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'd know that I'm a big advocate for character development. Without character development, most films just seem bland and stagnant. There's got to be some conflict for your main characters, and they need to change somehow by the end of the movie. That's what makes it most compelling, in my opinion. Of course, there's nothing really wrong with enjoying a comedy that's just joke after joke, even if it doesn't really go anywhere, but I usually don't find those movies as enjoyable as the ones where the protagonist goes through some kind of unique hero's journey. There are certain exceptions, but it's the exception, not the rule. Even from the very start of this movie, it's obvious that Susan and Paul Rudd aren't perfect for each other because Derek is a huge narcissistic jerk and Susan is a huge pushover. But getting hit with a Quantonium meteor, becoming a federal inmate, and making friends with a gang of Lovecraftian nightmares, then saving California from a giant alien robot and securing her freedom is all that it takes for her to realize that this guy ain't the one that she should be with. It's like, no, seriously, this is a great analogy. It's like that trend from a few years ago where girls ask their boyfriends, "Would you still love me if I was a worm?" Like, obviously no, what the heck do you mean? But this movie really said, would you love me if I was a giant 50-foot girl boss who can use family vehicles for roller skates? And my boy Derek said no. And ironically, that's what gives her the boost she needs to come into her own and become the strong, independent woman that she was meant to be. Sorry, that went off the rails a little bit, but the point is, it takes a wild series of events, and finally Susan realizes that she's not strong because of the Quantonium, but because of her strength of will, or something like that, but also totally the Quantonium. But like, all jokes aside, for real, as silly as it sounds, she finally has a group of friends that accept her and love her for who she is, as opposed to her shallow girlfriends from the beginning of the movie, and she has a newfound confidence in that, which inevitably leads to the successful defeat of their enemy. And these themes are present in a lot of other movies, even ones in the sci-fi genre, but because it's satirical, it doesn't come across as preachy or unwarranted, and they're just able to slide it in without being cliche. And on that note, there is one thing that I think this movie falls dreadfully short in. The villain, Galaxar, sucks. Voice acting is great, don't get me wrong. Rainn Wilson always kills it, but as a villain, he really falls flat in comparison to a lot of other Dreamworks villains. Dreamworks usually does a fantastic job of creating villains that are really counterbalances to their protagonist, and pose a good threat to the general well-being of the universe which they live in. But This guy, the alien octopus with a cheap joke for a backstory, it's just not great. Yes, you can make an argument that that's the point. He's a foil for Susan, being overconfident, self-absorbed, and she's learning to be a better human, slowly regaining her confidence through her friendship with her ragtag team, blah, 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 blah. But even so, he's just not very interesting. He frankly seems too goofy to pose a real threat, whereas someone like Shen in Kung Fu Panda 2 has comedic moments but also poses a legitimate threat to the integrity of the world, and more personally, to pose emotional and spiritual balance. That's really compelling. But Galaxar is just used as a plot device to up the stakes and get Susan to where she needs to be mentally. It's like we got to this point on the hero's journey diagram, and the writers were just like, what can we do to up the stakes? We need a big fight at the end of the movie. This guy. I also don't think it helps that we don't really see much of him until the third act of the movie. He could have been built up a lot more. And I know people could say that the same thing is true about Shen. He's just used to develop the plot and get the protagonist to where he needs to be. But I think it's just done in such a more classy and interesting way that feels dynamic in that movie. And I know what you're going to say. Again, it's satire. That's fine. But I don't think satire and genuine plot tension are mutually exclusive. It's hard, but it can be done. Maybe you guys disagree, and that's okay, but does this movie have high stakes for you? Can you feel the tension? Seriously, let me know in the comments. I genuinely like to hear your take on this, because this is a movie I grew up with, and I love it. I think we could do with a few more films like it nowadays, but I think it just would have genuinely been much more compelling, and might I add, funnier, if instead of Galaxar being a goofy little alien man, he was actually like a real threat that just played things totally stone-faced, and all of the monster crew could still be witty and sarcastic themselves. Take a look at Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, which is a fantastic movie, came out a couple years ago. Yeah, it's funny and clever, and still tangentially set in the satirical Shrek universe. That was a hard sentence to say, but Death is genuinely a terrifying villain. They portray him as a serious, poignant threat to Puss's life, where Death Wolf creates real tension and only relents after Puss's demeanor changes at the end of the movie. In Monsters vs. Aliens, Galaxar is just a little silly fellow who makes a silly plan and has a big silly head and a silly backstory and just not much to offer. I wish they had done a better job with this, though I can understand why they went the route they did. It certainly fits into the satirical genre and pokes fun at the whole alien invasion niche if the antagonist is more goofy than threatening. But I digress. But you may be asking yourself, yeah, this movie is fine, but it's not the best DreamWorks movie out there. And honestly, I would agree, 100%. That's not the point of this video. Like I said, it's not perfect. I wish the villain was better, among other minor things. But my point in making this video was, well, one, just to have fun exploring the absurdity of a movie that I grew up on and haven't watched in a long time. And two, to prove that even though this movie isn't perfect, it's one of the best examples of what DreamWorks core is. An animation company that's absurdly good at taking an entire genre and just turning it inside out, staying witty and entertaining while retaining genuinely emotional moments. And they do that in a way that even if you're a huge fan of the other genre they're poking fun at, the writing is incredibly clever and compelling and just enjoyable for everyone. This is the kind of movie where even a die-hard sci-fi fan can watch it, have a few laughs, and say to themselves, well, yeah, they've got a point. Well, that's it for me today, y'all. Thanks for watching all the way through. If you did make it this far, go ahead, consider subscribing. I put out videos whenever I have a thing I want to make videos on. I also need to pad the runtime right here at the end, so ads and, good stuff like that. So I'm just going to keep talking for 10 more seconds just to make sure that YouTube approves my video for lots of good green dollar signs.